Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, is at the United Nations headquarters. And James, of course, it's not just the war in Ukraine. It's also a time of natural disasters around the world. Millions of people desperately in need of help. That is something that's on the UN agenda as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. When world leaders come here every year for this week, they discuss all the crises in the world. But this year, very much, the war in Ukraine is dominating proceedings. We're supposed to have a meeting later on today with the Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi, with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. We had the news overnight that the Secretary of State's father, sadly, has passed away, so not clear whether that meeting will go ahead, and if it does, who will participate from the US. But that is likely to be a meeting that's dominated by events in Ukraine, I would have thought, as well as lots of other issues that those two superpowers need to discuss. Let's discuss what's been going on this week with an important player. That's the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer. Thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Let me start with Ukraine. The situation on the ground, the humanitarian situation. You're one of the biggest humanitarian organisations in the world. How bad is it?
Well, it's pretty stark. As you know, we have been in Ukraine on the ground since 2014, and we have seen 8 years of protracted conflict, which has already weakened the society and disrupted the Ukrainian society since February, with the intensification of warfare, with the level of destruction, internal displacement, refugees coming out of Ukraine. This country has been heavily affected, and therefore our response to all the multiplicity of humanitarian needs had to be scaled. Importantly, today, Ukraine is the largest operation of ICRC, and this is a reflection of the humanitarian needs on the ground.
You're not just a humanitarian organisation. You have in the international system a unique role of governing the Geneva Conventions, which are effectively the rules of war, a historic role you have there. Can I ask you, with that hat on, the situation in Ukraine? Only in the last few hours, the UN Commission of Inquiry, which is looking into Ukraine, has talked about war crimes. How worried are you that the rules of war in Ukraine and elsewhere are no longer being respected?
We are, of course, worried in Ukraine and globally. As you rightly say, we are involved with the parties to the conflict, with the armed forces, with the security forces, to have international humanitarian law respected. And there is no conflict in the world where we don't see disrespect. The question is how we work afterwards with the party, how we try to influence them. And as you know, it is really the template of confidential dialogue, the methodology to really go to the commanders, to the ministers of defense with our findings on the ground, and to ask for better behavior, for change of behavior, for accountability within the armed forces. And here, I think, in Ukraine and elsewhere, it's a huge challenge. Between the necessity to protect civilian populations and the military objectives to defeat the adversary, we always see the balance tilt towards military logic instead of protection logic of civilians. And this is what challenges us each and every day. But in Ukraine and elsewhere, we really try to forge our ways into the mindset and into the thinking and into the military orders in order to allow international humanitarian law to at least have some relevance in the conflict. And then I should say, of course, our first worries are the people themselves, the families, those who are immediately affected by military operations. And I think it is important that more consideration everywhere in the world is taken to respect those basic rules.
In this week, you end up speaking with presidents and prime ministers and ministers. Are you worried that the war in Ukraine is taking up all the conversation when there are so many other crises from previous years in Yemen, in Syria, in Africa, which haven't been solved, which are still there and no one's talking about?
Indeed, there is a real inequity of attention, which is probably the first big problem and consequence of the war in Ukraine. I have difficulties, except for the parties to the Yemeni, the Syrian, the Sahelian conflicts, to find any interest whatsoever also from political leaders to discuss these issues, because all the attention is on Ukraine. And then you have the real-time effect of this conflict, the impact on the world economy, the fact that many of the poorest countries who have already experienced famine, difficulties to cope with multiple challenges like climate change and pandemic, are now double and triple affected by the real-time ripple effects of the Ukrainian crisis. And so there is a discrepancy. On the one side, everybody looks and finances and tries to do work in Ukraine, and on the other hand, there are an increasing number of forgotten conflicts, which is worrisome because you never know when these conflicts will come back to the international attention because of deep impact that they still have on societies.
It's a grim picture. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera. You're just finishing 10 years in the job, and obviously you look at the state of the world now compared with 10 years ago. There are so many raging conflicts that were not here a decade ago. Rob.
James, thanks very much. Our diplomatic editor, James Bay, is outside the UN headquarters there.